Hello, everybody, and welcome. We have come to 5 o'clock, so we're going to get started. Welcome to this evening's roundtable event. Today, we're going to be talking about the art and science of accents and dialects, bridging linguistics and dialect coaching. So I'm Louisa Morgan. I'm a lecturer here. I'm with the Voice Study Centre with responsibility for spoken voice provision here. Today's event is our first collaborative event with our partner university, Essex University. So I am thrilled to be welcoming two members of Essex University's Linguistics Department as part of our expert panel. And I wish a very warm welcome to any of you who come as staff or students from Essex this evening. And this is a particularly special outreach event that I'm delighted was able to be presented to you as a free event today. And I'm enormously grateful to the huge generosity of this evening's panelists who have given up their time to offer their expertise this evening. And to Debbie Winter as well for allowing me to put this event together. And I also would just like to start by recognising the work of voice coach Anne Whitaker and linguist Beatrice Szczepek Reed, who are both here as panellists this evening and whose inspiring work on prosody in dialect coaching was what prompted the idea for today's event. We have a fantastic group of experts who I'm going to hand over to now to allow them to introduce themselves. So I'm just going to start by asking Anne if you would like to introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Anne Whitaker, and I'm a voice and accent coach. I work in film, TV, and theatre, but I also teach at a variety of drama schools, and I also teach on the Voice Studies master's course at Central School for Speech and Drama. And my background is that I have a undergraduate degree in linguistics and theatre, and then I did my master's at Central. And so I'm really pleased to be here at this event. So thank you so much, Louisa.
Thank you very much. And over to you, Sterre.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sterre Maier. Sterre is fine in English. I am joint head of voice at Mount View, which is one of the big drama schools in the UK. I think we're one of the best drama schools in the UK. We not at all humble. We have a very big diverse a group of students in our school, and lots of international students. I am from the Netherlands myself, so I'm very connected to the second language speakers or additional language speakers, which is also my interest and my research interest. I studied musical theatre myself before I came to the UK, and then did a master's in voice and singing. I believe that degree no longer exists, but it was at the University of Surrey. And I've worked, so currently I predominantly work in voice, spoken voice work, but I've done a lot of directing and coaching in theatre where English was not the language that the show was in. So in Romanian, in Bulgarian, in Korean, which is very interesting. So I've got a big love for different languages, for how you can get messages across through more than just the words. And yeah, I'm currently working on a research project to look into accent coaching in the UK for second language learners and how we can make that more accessible, more inclusive, because very often they are not treated differently, and actually they are incredibly different from first language speakers. So that's me.
Thank you very much, Sterre. Handing over to you, Beatrice, now.
Thank you, Louisa, and yes, lovely to see you all. Welcome to this event. I'm Beatrice Szczepek Reed. I have worked closely with Anne Whitaker now for a few years, but my background is in linguistics. I'm Professor of Linguistics now at Lancaster University, and I do have a degree in singing as well from many years ago. But my linguistic expertise is in phonetics and phonology, and specifically I apply that to naturally occurring conversations. So I literally record people as they're having dinner, or as they're driving in their car, or cooking a meal, or whatever, and then analysing how people use their voice in real life dialogue, and that's what Anne and I have been exploring together as well.
Thank you, Beatrice. Ella, now, please.
Hello, everybody. I'm Ella Jeffries, a lecturer in linguistics at the University of Essex. So my kind of background and my research and teaching focuses in on sociolinguistics and more specifically accent dialect variation in the UK. So I'm interested in all sorts of things around accent dialect variation, but in particular, how we become aware of accent dialect differences in childhood and how we develop these certain kinds of accent based language attitudes based on different accents, accent biases, and how all that kind of works and progresses. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you, Ella. Handing over to Nina now.
Hi everyone, my name is Nina Markl. I am a research fellow at the Department for Language and Linguistics and the Institute for Analytics and Data Science at the University of Essex. And my research is also in sociolinguistics and language variation and change, but also the intersection of that with language technologies, such as speech recognition tools and also the kinds of speech technologies that are used in voice training and coaching is also something that I'm quite interested in. So it is similarly sociolinguistics, but in particular with its intersection with technology.
Thank you, Nina. And to Jenru now, welcome.
Hi everyone, I'm Jenru Wang, Wang Jenru. I currently work as a senior voice tutor at Mountview as I work with Sterre, and I also coach freelance in theater, production, in film and TV with accent and language, as well as voice. I was trained as an actor in Taiwan, and I was trained at Central as well as a voice coach. And because I speak English as a second language, that's also why I had that blip in my head right now. Sometimes English is just not Englishing. And that's also why quite a lot of my work and accent coaching and language coaching is based on coaching Mandarin to actors who don't speak Mandarin. Or I focus a lot on East and Southeast Asian accent coaching, hence a lot of L2 accent and focusing a lot on East and Southeast Asian accent representation in the UK. That's where I base as well. Forgot to say that. Lovely to see you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. So wonderful to have so much expertise in the room with us. So the way this is going to work is that I'm going to read out a question and we're going to go around the panelists and just ask them to bring their insights to each question. And hopefully there will be a little bit of time after the question where you can have a bit more of a conversation between you as panelists. At this stage, I'm not going to invite questions from the audience, but there will be a Q&A at 7 o'clock where you can bring all of your questions at that stage. So do make a note of those questions and we will come to you when we get to that point. So to start with, our first question is about accents and authenticity. So the question is, what does it mean to produce an authentic accent or dialect as a performer? What could voice coaches learn from linguists about authenticity in accents and dialects? So let's start with Anne. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Hello. Yeah, it's always good to get to go first, but also as I gather my thoughts, really, Beatrice will probably be able to speak to this much better than I can, because so much of our work, I feel like, touches on authenticity. And what I've learned from Beatrice's work as a linguist is, because she has shared with me so much of her data and reading her work, it's all about listening to real life conversation. And the more that you do that, then the more you kind of understand what is authenticity, because authenticity, as we know as theater practitioners, is often a funny dance between the performer feeling that they are authentic in their characterization or in their character, as well as the audience believing that it's authentic. And those two things don't always line up. You can often have an actor who feels like they've given the most authentic version of that performance, and the audience doesn't believe it, and vice versa as well. Sometimes the actor feels very disconnected from their performance, but the audience may feel that the performance is very authentic, or that the accent was very good or authentic. And so I think this is a very nebulous term and something that is really difficult. And so with my work with Beatrice, I've really found that although we'll probably never be able to name what it means to be authentic, of course, it's going to be different to each person, there's something about studying real life speakers that gives us a sense of grounding. And I think that's really, really useful. And I think so often it's quite easy to get caught up in only watching movies and film and television, which of course is great. We need to watch other performances, but actually really encouraging my accent students, or even just my voice students. Actually, a lot of Beatrice in my work is not just on accents, it's about on all of, the musicality of the spoken voice, which occurs in whatever accent you're speaking in, even if it's your native one. And really being able to observe what happens in real life and finding that in that lived in moment. So often what we talk about in spoken voice is, finding the thought. What does that mean? And from the work that Beatrice and I've done, I've just been so surprised that we hear it so clearly in real life. And so it's not this kind of made up conceit that we've created for theatre. It's actually something that we are trying to reflect. And so I think it's the listening that becomes so important, and that actually linguists have so much to offer in the way of listening, because they listen with such detail that we can often conflate in our own work. Sometimes we pick images for an accent that are impressionistic. They're sometimes very useful, but the more that we can connect those to real specificity, I think the better, right? And, many practitioners talk about this. Linklater talks about this with her imagery with anatomy, right? Making sure that the image matches the anatomy. And I think our images and our impressions of accents can also match the specificity of what's actually happening when we listen to it. Then we will get, our coaching will be improved, and our students will be improved. And so that's kind of my first thought on that question.
Thank you, Anne. Thank you very much. And I'd love to hand that question over to Sterre now.
Thank you. Yeah. Oh, I need to take one of those earpieces out. Sorry. So my current focus and interest is so much on second language learners, and that word authentic is impossible for a second language speaker, because everything we do is work towards what is kind of perceived as correct English, and so we're working towards a standard already, and that doesn't feel authentic necessarily to how we would potentially speak ourselves. It took me probably 15 years, if I'm honest, or at least 10, to speak English in a way that I felt was authentic to myself, and I have no idea how I got there, but it took a long time of living here and being here and becoming more of an English person or an English version of myself, I should say. So I find the term authentic for any second language accent really complicated. It's also usually when we look at second language accents, we say, well, just do a French accent, which is problematic because that's a huge country. What are we talking about? So how can you be authentic when you're looking at an entire country? So Anne's point of being as specific as possible and listening to real life people, I think, is essential. When it comes to second language speakers, that then doesn't necessarily give you authentic in a sense of where they are from, because it is also connected to how they have learned English. So it's just a very complex term, I think, and I'm very much looking at second language speakers. I was looking also at the term itself. I just went into a little deep dive because I thought, why do I feel so strange about this word? And I didn't realize this before, but the word itself stands for real and not imitated, which for, of course, actors is a little bit funny because that's what we do. So it's basically impossible. But if we imitate sources that are real, then we can get as close as possible. I have one more thought about this, sorry, and then I will hand off to the next person. But that is related to consistency. Because when we listen to authentic speakers, there is an inconsistency. There's constant inconsistencies in accents. And I hope we all in this space agree and recognize that accents are fluid and that there are constant things we pick up on. Oh, they did that and they didn't do it this time. And again, when we're looking at second language speakers, there is much less acceptance of that. When we're listening to those things, we often perceive them as wrong, as opposed to just fluctuations within the accent. And so that also just it just sparked my interest and curiosity. How do we deal with that? I don't know is the real answer. So I'm not really answering your question with ideas. I'm just answering it with more questions. And I'm very keen to hear from the linguists on this. So I'm a bit gutted that I had to go that early, but come on, bring it on with the more answers, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Sterre. Some really excellent points. So handing over to Beatrice now, we would love to hear from you.
Thank you very much. I should say straight away, I'm not a sociolinguist, and my two colleagues here will I think answer much better from that perspective. But I would perhaps I really loved what you were just pointing out, Sterre, in terms of of any kind of vocal production not being consistent and fixed throughout, certainly not throughout somebody's lifespan, and not even throughout the day. And there'd be so many vocal adjustments we would make to even the room. I mean, every singer obviously knows that, and every actor, but every type of interaction, and who are we talking to? What kind of interaction is it? Is it formal? Is it informal? Whatever. What kind of social action are we doing within that interaction? So are we, at the very beginning, are we greeting each other? Are we telling each other a joke? Are we paying somebody a compliment? Whatever. And all of these things would have vocal designs that would be, again, not consistent for every time we say thank you to a compliment, but specific to that very particular moment that has played out in that specific way, where exactly those words were being used, and therefore precisely that vocal design would have been appropriate. And then, of course, that's the thing that Anne and I have worked on the most, is the other speakers in the conversation who so much influence, certainly the musical elements of our voice. And the intonation we might use, the rhythm, the speech rate, the voice quality might be using, incredibly strongly influenced by who we're speaking to, and specifically who spoke just before us, and who we are, not who, but in what way they spoke, and then the speaking turn that we are responding to really influences how we are speaking. Now, I think in terms of accent and dialect, obviously there are features, and nobody will deny. I'm being a little bit radical in saying it's perhaps slightly overrated. Obviously there are features that are really important and that don't change depending on who you're talking to. But I perhaps just want to guard against the idea that there is one authentic way of speaking. And I'll just say one final point, and many of you, again, I'm also a second language speaker, and many others will recognize this, in the sort of applied linguistic world of second language teaching. There's been, in sort of recent decades, a drive towards authentic teaching classroom materials. So rather than listening to, let's say, dialogues that were recorded for the purpose of teaching English, or reading texts that were written for the purpose of teaching English, reading actual newspaper articles, or listening to real authentic speakers. And that also has really been criticized, as a sort of a tool to get second language learners to speak in a standardized way, imitating native speakers. And I just want to bring that element in, that I think something similar might apply to performers, that there isn't perhaps a perfect natural way of speaking that should be imitated, but that natural or authenticity emerges in the moment for every individual at every moment in time. And the element of imitating something that was authentic at a different time is perhaps always going to be slightly flawed. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Yeah, thank you. Could I hand over to Ella now, please?
Hi, thank you. Yeah, so in terms of thinking about authenticity, I suppose I've been thinking about it from in terms of kind of perception, so how audience or how listeners or watchers might perceive the authenticity of actors in a show or in a dramatization. So there's a question around what the role of accent is playing within the context of the dramatization. So is it building into a broader picture of authenticity around the setting and the scenery? So I'm thinking of something like Peaky Blinders, where we've got that accent very much embedded in a particular time period, in a particular regional context, where it plays quite an important part and role in what makes those characters authentic and their lives and everything. Whereas what we sometimes get with the use of accent dialects in a more simplistic kind of almost more crass sense is a shortcut to a kind of characterization. So that kind of idea of using accent as a way to kind of portray someone as a cheeky, chappy Cockney character, or a upper class kind of well-spoken person, or whatever it might be, which can then kind of create this idea of what those accents are associated with. So I suppose there's authenticity in that sense of what is the accent doing? Is it having, what kind of role is it playing in that way? I was also thinking around authenticity in relation to time period, and some people have already mentioned, we know accents, dialects change massively over time. So is there an accuracy, or is there an idea around how authentic we are being to that particular time period? We know that, for example, even in things like Shakespeare, where we get the kind of the classic way of producing Shakespeare is through a very RP, received pronunciation kind of standard accent, whereas we know that at the time the accent would have been very, very different, and we're missing out actually on a whole load of kind of interesting word play and puns and all sorts of interesting stuff, based on the fact that, I guess, in a way, not being authentic to the accent of the time. So how much does that play a role, and how important is it to reflect that in performance, perhaps, is another question. Sorry, I've got a whole bunch of stuff that I'm thinking of saying. I'm trying to think what is most relevant to the conversation that everyone else has been having. The interesting thing I was thinking, again, because I'm coming from very much a perspective of looking at or being interested in how so-called non-standard or regional accents might be considered differently to a standard RP type accent. And some of you have already mentioned that often second language learners in particular are more often exposed to that kind of standard idea of what English is, which in reality most people don't actually speak, or a lot of people don't speak. And so there's an interesting idea about authenticity in relation to, let's say, regional non-standard accents in opposition to RP or standard British English, whereby there's the idea of how authentic, how real sounding is your Yorkshire accent or your Cockney accent. We don't really get that same question when it comes to an RP type accent. That the association with RP is more about how correct, how acceptable or correct is the way that accent is sounding. So there's an interesting idea around how authenticity is often applied to certain kinds of accents as opposed to others. And again, that gives us an idea of the sorts of associations people might have. I think that's kind of delving into question 2 a little bit, so I won't go too much into that as well in any more detail in answer to this first question. Authenticity, I was also thinking about authenticity in kind of English dialogue films that have a non-English based setting. So often we get that kind of, is it authentic enough for someone to have a generic Russian accent or German accent to present a character who is supposedly from one of those countries? And when do you go kind of fully authentic at the risk of losing any sort of comprehensibility? So that's quite an interesting one. I saw Brendan Gunn, who's a dialect coach who worked with people like Brad Pitt on Snatch film, where he has that kind of Irish traveller accent, talk about how, I don't know if it was Brad Pitt himself decided he wanted to do it, but the idea of going full on authentic in a way, to make him at the risk of, well, I suppose in a way to again create that characterization of someone difficult to understand, and perhaps everything that came along with that. But that's a kind of conscious decision along the lines of how authentic do we go, and how do we kind of balance out what people are understanding and what they're therefore also perhaps judging that character based upon as well. Just a couple of things on, because the second part of the question was, I think, around what voice coaches could learn from linguists, and it sounds like you already have learned and know a lot anyway. But and actually this point was raised by a few of you already, but this idea of an accent being one thing, or it not being one thing, I suppose, more truthfully, is a big part of what makes an accent unique to everyone. So we all, in linguistic terms, we talk about accommodation, so speaking more like the people that you're speaking to and with. So it's not the case that that you have one set accent at anyone throughout, you know, the whole time that you're speaking. So that idea of fluidity that I think others have mentioned is a big one. And also just considering more generally the fact that accent is not just about region, it's not just about where we're from, it can be influenced by all sorts of other social factors, so social mobility, our gendered type differences, generational differences. Language varies and changes over time considerably, so I suppose kind of, yeah, one aspect is almost like keeping up to date with what those new changes are, what new varieties and accents are evolving, because they always are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. If I could hand that over to Nina now.
Sure. I feel like I'm just gonna try and like build on what Ella's just said, because I think a lot of that there's probably overlap in what we were thinking about. And I think the first thing that has already sort of been touched on when you look at this question of authenticity, the sort of obvious question that comes up to me is, who do we think of as an authentic model to sort of build off? And that is something, and this within sociolinguistics as well, I think there has been quite a lot of interest in problematizing this notion of authenticity as well, because that is something that sociolinguists were also always really interested in, and this idea of like there is an authentic speaker and an authentic sort of representative of a particular variety, and we can sort of distill it into a bundle of features that we can look at. And I think that is also the sort of question when you then go into dialect coaching, when you're then trying to imitate a particular variety, the real question is who is that like authentic model that you're thinking of? And I think I don't know, I don't have a good answer to this, but I think it's really interesting, this tension between you want something that is sort of actually real and therefore sort of authentic in that sense, as in there are real people who speak like that, but also you want something that is salient enough that it actually can do this particular kind of the sort of semiotic work that you want it to do. Like it does actually signal something because people can recognize it as, you know, a French accent or whatever, or as a Yorkshire accent or something like that. And so you have to pick out things that will be salient to the audience and salient enough that they are authentic, but they can't be too stereotyped, because then they're no longer authentic. So I think this this tightrope is really, really interesting. And when it comes to questions of going fully authentic might actually mean that depending on who your audience is, they don't just not understand in the sense of comprehend what the person is saying, but they might just not understand who they're supposed to be, if that makes sense, because it might be a very particular accent that is recognizable to people as like, I don't know, from the north of Wales, but that is not necessarily at all sort of legible to an audience in the United States, who might at best think of it as Welsh, but they might just think of it as sort of strange and they can't place it anywhere. So I think this is, to me, this is more, I guess, a question as well in terms of like a question from me to everyone else, where I find it really, really interesting, that difficulty of picking out something that is salient for the particular audience when you don't actually know who your audience necessarily is, which is a very different thing from the way we're in everyday interaction, where we can tailor our speech to our audience a lot more, and whether that's consciously or unconsciously. And the one other thing I wanted to just flag, just because it's not been mentioned yet, is the sort of role of embodiment as well in dialect and then and sort of accent production. So this is something that I'm also sort of interested in, because there's been a lot of research in both phonetics and sort of sociophonetics, more specifically around the role of the sort of the role of precisely how you produce the speech, I guess, in not just the speech sound, but the sort of broader kind of character that creates, the broader way that, you know, how that shapes your facial so your sort of facial performance and so on and so forth, right? And that's obviously something that's also a part of it. And I think that's another sort of interesting layer on top of it, that what is authentic is not just the speech sounds, but also how you then deliver this, so that it's not, again, overly stereotyped. So I think I'm not sure what there is. I feel like whenever anybody asks like what can X learn from linguists, it tends to be everything is a lot more complicated than, you know, then it would be nice for it to be, everything turns out to be more complex. I feel like it's a lot of the time the answer. I work a lot with computer scientists who like, what can computer scientists learn from linguists? And my answer is, it is so much more complicated than would be nice for this particular context. And I feel like this is very similar here, where like, it turns out it is a lot more complicated, and somehow you need to focus, you need to figure out what it is you can use for the performance and what it is you can ignore for the sake of the performance. And that is something that you can't learn from us. That is something that you can tell us about, because that is something that you somehow need to figure out, that I think you know, we are ill-equipped to even see what that is. We just see when it works, and we see when it doesn't work, I guess, just like any audience. So yeah, I guess these are just questions. Sorry, though, that none of that was an actual response. All of those were further questions.
Lovely. Thank you very much. And handing that over to Jenru now.
Okay, so many thoughts. I'll try my best to be succinct in my thought. But maybe I can start with authenticity. I feel like for me, and in the work that in the field that I work as well, I feel like authenticity is like Anne said, is a dialogue. It's an agreement. And I feel like in performer, to put a performer in a context of a performance, authenticity sometimes can look drastically different, meaning being authentic in a Tim Burton film will be very different from being authentic in a, I don't know, like Sofia Coppola's film. And that goes to accent as well. And sometimes I feel like if it's a theater show, sometimes the audience have more physical presence to be there to be able to have that dialogue to accommodate the accent with the audience compares to film. And then maybe that's also why we have a lot of subtitles now, because people, we use that as a support to comprehend the meaning. Thought is fleeting. And yes, when it comes to authenticity and what Beatrice talked about, what at moments of your speech you use different tone and also accommodating One example that I always use is if you think about a moment where you were in your favorite singer's gig, when the singer go on stage and you scream for like 30 seconds. If I put that 30-second of you into a local grocery store and you scream for 30 seconds there, people would think that you're crazy and inauthentic. But you in that concert hall was the most authentic self at that moment. And I think in a lot of the case, the dramaturgy of what authentic means in a film or in a theater space is similar to that. So I think for me, what we can draw from linguist is sometimes the best way that I can put it is an analogy. Um, in my head, it sort of feels like if you go into Photoshop when you have that grid of changing the color, sometimes you can play with that color so much that the picture becomes almost feels like it has a different filter to it, a different aesthetic to it. But there will be a point where you change that so much that the picture becomes unrecognizable. And I feel like the feature for me serves in that way. What are the things, what are the salient features that I can put in to make the picture recognizable, but at the same time, dramaturgically, I can make it as stylistic as I want and have that dialogue with the audience. And then when is the moment that the picture got too exposed or the contrast got too much or too little that we can't recognize what they are. And I think that's where the knowledge of the feature comes from for me.
Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you, for all of those brilliant insights. And thank you for being so concise, because it means that we do have a little bit of time for you to speak to one another. So I'm going to invite the panelists now to, I can see Sterre raising a hand, to feel free to just unmute as and when feels appropriate for you to speak to one another. So let's start with Sterre.
Sorry to be such a keen bean. I think as I was listening to you all, thank you so much. This is really exciting and wonderful to hear the different perspectives. And Anne mentioned real sources, and when I just started, I was coaching a drama school performance of The Crucible, and I was digging deep and going, oh, so it has to be like a Norfolk accent. Let me find like the oldest recording I can find, which was absolutely impossible to comprehend. I really couldn't, I could barely understand what they were saying, and it wasn't just me being a second language speaker. And so obviously that wasn't going to work. And then one of the cast members said, oh, I'm from Norfolk, and sounded very standard English to me. So I was really battling with that struggle. Now I would go, let's find someone from there who sounds realistic, as we were saying, realistic to a certain audience, and actually verbatim work with them. And I think the verbatim approach, listening but also embodying, as some of you were saying, embodying the work, and it brings you closer to the character. It enables you to find the prosody, and we have a project at Mountview where we use verbatim to do an impression of working towards an impression of a performer. But in the first week they do just a verbatim performance of one person, and in week 2 they do a verbatim performance of 2. So it's with another person, and it's a dialogue, but also the 2 actors are listening to each other in the moment. And I think those scenes are the most authentic performances that I've seen, and sounds that come from actors that would normally really struggle with accents and find it really difficult to connect, because we're talking about authenticity in terms of what it sounds like and how they embody it. But I think it's also very important to recognize an actor connecting with it themselves, and finding ease with the sounds. So I think, yeah, verbatim has been a really wonderful tool to achieve that.
Yeah, I just want to second that, Sarah. Verbatim, I know it's being used at RADA and at Central, and it's been quite a successful tool in kind of allowing students to build this kind of embodied and very specific performance. And even students who would normally go, accents are really hard for me. It's, you know, I can't figure out what the pattern is. I can't kind of hang on to it because they have a whole character and other vocal qualities of that individual person to hang on to. There's suddenly, yeah, an ability to embody that in a different way. And then I've also seen actors then take that to the next step, where then they go, okay, now I'm no longer going to be this specific individual. I'm going to create my own character that's based off of me doing this accent, because now I have an understanding of how this works by doing that really specific work. And of course, you know, what's great in drama schools is we that do have that time. We often don't have that time on set or in a rehearsal room. But I have found that thinking about the authenticity of the model. So who's an authentic model? And, you know, something that I know lots of voice coaches, especially experienced voice coaches, know for sure is that you have to find a different model for each actor you work with and for each character that they do. And that's something that I really try to provide resources for all my actors, is really going, okay, well, who's your character? Who are you? And who's a good representation of that accent, and kind of try and give them a couple of samples that really fit that. And so I find most of my time as an accent coach is trying to find the perfect sample for them to go home and listen to. And of course, encouraging them to listen to loads of different voices, but trying to find those samples that really speak to the character they're trying to play, as well as, you know, someone who maybe has a similar resonance to them. You know, I'll sometimes have students come to me and you know, they're trying to learn a standard Southern English, and they're like, oh, well, I listened to Stephen Fry reading Harry Potter and he's standard Southern English, right? And I'm like, yes, but you're a 24-year-old female, and I don't think Stephen Fry's voice is going to help you find your most authentic version of that accent. And you know, it doesn't occur to a lot of people. And sometimes, of course, we don't have much time, so we've got our set resources. But I think for me, it's learning from linguists means it's like, well, there's never set data, right? You just have to keep collecting more and more and more. And just seeing from Beatrice's work how much data she has on all these different samples, I just find it mind-boggling how we can get stuck in kind of using like, oh, these 3 people are my go-to for standard Southern English. And actually, no, we should have dozens and dozens and dozens. And even our dialect archives, there's some really great resources, but they're not enough. And so I find I use a lot of YouTube clipping, and I use a lot of, you know, finding every single time I do an accent, even if I've taught it 20 times before, I just ask more people and see if I can get more recordings. And the other thing that I'd like to say about kind of finding an authentic model as well is that I think especially when we're first, especially because I teach accent coaches how to be an accent coach, so much of it is based off of reading passages. And as Beatrice mentioned, right, having authentic recordings is really important now. And I think a lot of us know this, and trying to find that extemporaneous speech for our samples is so important. But something that from Beatrice and I's work that I've really started applying to my own work is actually finding people in dialogue. So not just finding somebody telling a story on their own, but actually have a conversation. And so really trying to find 2 people who fit in the same kind of accent category. Again, you know, are they both that authentic model? I don't know, but having 2 people who, you know, both from, say, Manchester, they might have some differences, but that actually, if you get them in a dialogue, you're going to have a much better holistic idea of what that accent is like, and also start to put together what are those kind of overall features that make us feel like they're both from Manchester. And I believe they're both from Manchester, even if they're doing slightly different accent features.
I was just going to jump in there and say that's a really important point that you're just saying, because we know from social linguistic work that we stylistic shifting is a very real thing. So when, and I'm sure you know, as actors and voice coaches, so the way that we read, or even how we're speaking today when talking to one another, people we don't know so well, we're going to shift the way that we speak, and our authentic, most authentic, or sometimes we talk about the vernacular way of speaking, our kind of more most casual, everyday, natural way of speaking is not going to be as apparent, and we're not going to get perhaps some of those features that you might be looking for when you're kind of trying to classify or trying to replicate particular accent dialect features. So yeah, I think that's really important.
Do we have a little bit more time, Louisa? Is that okay to jump in for one more thought?
Please go ahead.
Okay. I was thinking about the Barbershop Chronicles as an example of not just going, we need to meet the audience. because it was, I don't know if anyone has seen it, but it was a very groundbreaking production where the voice coach and the actors quite clearly decided, we're not going to be clear for the general public. We're going to be true to what you would hear on the street in the places that we are representing here. And the world that was therefore created was one where some of us felt a little othered and outside, but because of the way that it was set up, which was, you know, as an audience, you were very close to the action, we were thereby included, rather than being included just by the sounds, by being accommodated and shifted so that we would understand it. It was, for me, it was such an incredible experience because I felt respected by that, rather than kind of patronized, going, oh, let me just change it for you. I felt like, okay, this is so wonderful because you understand that I don't need to be let into a world by it changing for me. You're just going, this is what we do, this is who we are, follow what you can. And if you don't follow something, it's probably not meant for you, is it? It was a very exciting thing, and I hope it'll happen more and more. I think I'm dipping into the next question a little bit with that, maybe, perhaps, but I was just intrigued by this idea of we have to meet the audience, because as you were saying, Nina, I think it was, we don't always know the audience when we are working in theatre. When we are working in film, we nowadays know that film reaches everywhere, and so we can thereby acknowledge that the audience is like, most people will be watching it with subtitles. You know, many English people don't think about that when they produce things, but that is the reality of it. Most second language speakers, which is most of the world still, will be actually watching it with subtitles. And yeah, they won't necessarily understand that accent in Peaky Blinders word for word, but they'll be reading along, they'll be enjoying it just as much. And so I think, yeah, I just want more of that truthfulness to the people that are being represented, as opposed to, let's make sure the audience understand it. It's not always up to us, let me be clear. It's not always up to the voice coach, because the trouble is that the directors and the producers are the ones who make those calls. And so it's a long uphill battle, but what I thought worth mentioning in this space where I believe we're on the same page.
Thank you very much. We do have a few minutes left. We're going to take a little bit of a break at 5:02, but we have a few minutes left. And I wonder if anybody else would like to speak on this idea that sort of keeps popping up about intelligibility. Is there anybody else who would like to maybe speak to that point a little bit more directly?
Well, I'm sure I'll say something that certainly my linguistics colleagues already know, but intelligibility is a huge concept in applied linguistics, in the sense that in 2000 there was a book that came out by someone called Jennifer Jenkins called A Phonology for English as an International Language. And the proposal in very simplified form was basically that our aim for teaching English pronunciation shouldn't be aiming for any form of correct native speaker pronunciation, but a version of English that is intelligible, and most importantly, similar to what Sterre just said, intelligible to other non-native speakers of English, because the vast majority of speakers of English in the world are not native speakers. And so since then, hugely controversial in many ways, but broadly, I guess, accepted as an important step forward in how we think about accuracy and, in some senses, I guess, authenticity. And when I speak to Anne, I realize that there are similar feelings and perhaps a sense of ideologies maybe battling in the world of voice for performance, around what's actually correct, and in this day and age, is that even something we can apply, and isn't intelligibility a more useful concept?
Thank you. Maybe we could take one more point on that from somebody.
Yeah, if I can jump in on this. I find the unsurprisingly perhaps, I find the notion of technological change sort of shifting how people design or prioritize particular decisions in both in the coaching side, but also maybe from the sort of production side of what do we prioritize. Quite interesting. So this idea that maybe intelligibility is not as important if there's an affordance in your medium that there is text, right, that comes with it. So you don't actually need to catch every word, which is maybe very different from a theatre production where you do need to catch more of the words, perhaps. This is, again, I'm speaking sort of way out of my area of expertise when it comes to the differences of different sort of media, but the idea being that, you know, the intelligibility is no longer as important, and that maybe lets you be in some ways more authentic or do things that are artistically more interesting, and perhaps more difficult to comprehend for every single viewer, but in combination with subtitles, for instance, you then get, oh, you have this very sort of authentic accent from a very particular place that most people have never heard before, but it's still perfectly, it is in many ways much more authentic than doing a more generic accent for like a broader region, right? So I'm thinking of like maybe there's a very specific region of, I don't know, New Zealand, and you do that instead of doing something that is more sort of standard New Zealand English that an international audience would be familiar with. And you can get away with that perhaps because you've got a completely different model in which people engage with the medium. And therefore, you know, it's no longer as big of an issue if there's lots of words that they don't necessarily immediately recognize, or if there's some pronunciations that are sort of too unfamiliar to them. So yeah, I think that's really just a really interesting point, and something that I just hadn't really thought about as like a particular artistic choice as well.
Thank you very much. I think we probably take one more, maybe from a coach to speak to this, if there's a coach perspective.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I think also because Sterre's point about, you know, what is intelligibility, some of it can be told through body language. And I think somebody just put in the chat as well, right? Even in theatre, that there's this, you know, ability to communicate beyond words, and actually that the sounds of an accent can communicate a feeling and a place and location. So even if we're missing some of the content or the meaning, that actually the form of the sounds tells part of that story. And I think that's something that we are moving more and more towards, about, you know, that form and content aren't so separate, you know, so we're always so worried about understanding the content of the words and the text. And as somebody who loves text, I am very concerned with that, but also as an accent coach, it's the sounds are so transportive. And so how can we, you know, make a dance between those two things that take the audience to that place, I think is really important. And also, I think what's really interesting actually is that on film and TV, so often a lot of my actors really conflate authenticity with basically mumbling. And actually, even those little tiny microphones can't pick that up, and that the sound people are having to turn those microphones so hot that they hear every move of your shirt. And so it actually ruins a lot of the audio. And then you have to go back and do that in ADR. And then that builds another question about authenticity, because you're having to reimagine yourself in a place, you're doing it in the studio, you're not picking up everything that's live. And a lot of directors hate ADR because it doesn't sound right, it doesn't sound authentic to that place, that moment, that time. But you can fix and correct whatever you need to fix and correct. So, you know, even in film and TV, there is this delicate dance between that, as well as in theatre, obviously, where we have to project our voices, and that there's maybe a little bit more leeway for what we deem as authentic in that space. But yeah, I think there's so many levels to that, and especially from the rehearsal process to the finished process, or from pre-production to post-production.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And yes, I had neglected the chat. I'm sorry. I've seen that there are a couple of points in there. But if you have thoughts or questions, everybody, we will have plenty of time at the end. At 7 o'clock, there's a whole dedicated slot. So please do bring your voices to that point. So we'll take a short comfort break now. It's 5 to 6 UK time. And we'll take a 10-minute break. So we'll come back in 10 minutes. Please feel free not to leave the Zoom room. It will remain open. But if you would like to turn your cameras and microphones off, and we'll see you in 10 minutes. Thank you very much. Welcome back, everybody. And we'll just give people a minute to rejoin the room. So, yes, welcome back, everybody. So let's move into question 2 then, please. So in question 2, we're asking about accents and audience. So the question is, how are regional accents perceived? What can linguists tell us? What can or should we be doing about it? I'm using the word we. I think I probably should be using the term voice coaches there. What can or should voice coaches be doing about it? So this is looking to promote a little bit more of that idea of the collaboration, the potential collaboration. So let's start in the same order, if that's okay, as we did before, and let's go to Anne.
Well, what a big question. I mean, regional accents, even I suppose the definition of what that means, how big is that region? How small is that region? I think relates back really to what we started talking about in that first question, which is, what is authentic to that story, and, what should that region be? And I think as voice coaches, there's a lot of dialogue happening now about the role of those telling stories. And I can't remember, maybe it was I can't remember if it was Ella saying, but I think it was about the broader image of authenticity, or also the shortcut to characterization. I can't remember if it was Ella or Nina, but I think so often regional accents, especially in the UK, but also in the US, are used to create a shortcut to character, often comedy, northern accents being seen as funny or dumb, and then in the US, southern accents being that kind of comparison. And so much of our role as voice coaches can be to try to subvert those stereotypes, to bring a sense of authenticity to it, but also we do always come into that dialogue with the director and the producer, and they get to call those final shots. So when we have to teach someone a northern accent and it's a funny role, but we don't get to decide if they do that accent or not, can we teach them that accent to a level that shows respect for that accent while still honoring that the role is funny, and that also northern people can be funny just like anyone else can be funny. So it is a delicate balance, because we don't always have the role to subvert those stereotypes, but that we can do that through rigor and specificity, I think is for me one of the big things. And I think, again, what I've learned from Beatrice is all about that specificity and really listening. And I'm sure Beatrice will speak to it more, and our other linguistics colleagues will also speak to it more, just about the variation we find in regional accents, and that are often our impressions, say a Belfast accent, it always goes up at the end, and actually that's not always the case. And there's lots of these amazing studies out there done by linguists on these specific regional accents that I think often we take for granted, or we don't read them because we don't have the time, or we don't think to look at linguistics resources as voice coaches. And actually some of those studies are really accessible, and even just reading the abstract or kind of their findings at the beginning, we don't have to necessarily read the whole length of the paper when we're doing our research, but actually you can find some really useful things just from doing that initial first broad brushstroke of research that will allow you to not make assumptions about regional accent that we then might pass on to the actor. So I think, there's lots of that I find really interesting and useful from our linguistics colleagues that we can use in our own work.
Thank you very much. Moving on to Sterre then.
Yes, I feel I don't want to sound pedantic, but I worry about that word again, same as authentic. I worry about the word of regional. It was mentioned already how it's either regional or standard. And what we're talking about is accents rather than regional accents. And it just, that's not something that we would use in the Netherlands, for example, as a term. And it really confused me when I came here. What are they trying to say with that? And it's it's a way of othering. you're either one of us, or you're from the regions, and it's just such an odd thing for me. I still haven't quite got my head around why we use that term here. I think language is incredibly important, and so I try not to use that term in my own work, and simply point out all of the different accents, and also to honor all of those different accents. I think we use regional for different regions of England, and then the different countries within the UK. There may be 3 in Scotland, and I think 2 in Wales that most people would clearly and easily identify, which it's just, I think it's problematic and a little disrespectful. So I just wanted to speak to that for a moment. Trying to gather my thoughts. How are they perceived? I am quite excited by the changes I have seen since I've come to this country, in especially television and TV work. I want to, for example, I've never actually watched this program, but I've seen so many adverts that I feel I know it well. But Gogglebox seems to be so full to the brim of different accents that are being celebrated. And I do think, Anne, your point about comedy is very much used there, because specific different accents there are funnier than others, perhaps. But it seems to me like it's being celebrated, and there's much more richness and diversity in what we see in film and TV than when I first moved here, for example. So I completely echo what Anne is saying in terms of what the directors and the producers demand from us, and how little we have to say in that. And I think there's quite a big issue there that I don't know how to tackle. I wish that these sorts of conversations would reach those places, those people. But I celebrate how different the perception of these accents is now than it was when I just started speaking and dreaming English on a regular basis. And I look forward to the film where yeah, I mean, I know that when we look at historical context, we can't have the maid speak RP. I get it, but I do enjoy more the films where that representation is not so stuck in that perceived hierarchy. Yeah, maybe that's because I'm an outsider, but I really celebrate those moments.
Thank you, Sterre. And perhaps I should apologise for the use of language in my questions, but you're going exactly where I was hoping, because these are words, this is terminology that is used a lot, and I think these are really important conversations to have. So thank you so much for those insights. So I would love to pass over to Beatrice now.
Thank you, Louisa. Again, I'm not a sociolinguist, and my colleagues will have more insightful things to say here. I love going after Sterre, because Sterre has got such sharp insights into things that I think many linguists have also been struggling with. And on top of the problem with reading, in some old-fashioned linguistic way of thinking, you might find standard accent, regional accents, but both of these would still be native speaking accents. And then beyond that, you would get the non-native speaking, which would not be, in a very, very conventional old-fashioned sense, would be distinct from regional accents, as if they were not somehow also regional. But as I say, hopefully that's long gone. I think, sometimes the underlying question of what we're discussing is, what can voice coaches learn from linguists? But actually, I think we all share a sense that everyone has an accent. And I think certainly in sort of more conventional linguistics, there is a sense that, why is that my problem? That society doesn't see it that way. We study the sounds. and they're in a way all equal. But there is, of course, there's a whole area of linguistics that studies language attitudes and the attitudes that society has towards language, and of course they are absolutely appalling. But we all have them ourselves. I think I'll maybe come back to the embodiment point that I think Nina made earlier. So in a good way and in a bad way, I think there is a perception around how we perceive somebody as a whole person, and then possibly judge their accent or judge their performance. There are terrible, not the experiments aren't terrible, but the findings are terrible, that we are incredibly influenced by what we see in terms of what accent we hear, be it the ethnicity of the person we see, the gender, whatever, what we're told about the person. There are experiments that show people who are maybe from different parts of you're told they're from different parts of the country, or they're from different ethnicities, or different educational backgrounds, and you hear exactly the same voice sample, but you judge it differently, and you judge how well you understand the sample. You say, I can hardly understand it, if you think it's a non-native speaker, whereas if you think it's somebody who went to Oxford, you adjust and you can understand all of that, and we all do it. But it does speak to how much everything else in addition to the voice signal influences our perception. And I assume an actor can work that to their advantage, perhaps. And I'm sure we've all seen examples of people, if you just listen to the voice signal, the accent isn't great, but you forget about it because there is so much else in what we're seeing in the overall picture that distracts us from that. So maybe that's a resource for performers. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, lovely. Let's hand over to Ella now, please.
Hi. So yeah, there's lots to say on this point of how accents are perceived, particularly in the UK context, which is the kind of background I have and the research that I'm familiar with. And although we might not want to use regional as a label in terms of kind of setting up people as sounding different to a sort of standard in any way, we do know that accents are the way in which accents are perceived by people in the UK are very much linked to how they're are very much linked to the region, to how regions are perceived, if that makes sense. So there's a lot of research looking at a kind of accent hierarchy that exists in the UK. One of our audience members here, Dominic Watt, sorry Dom to point you out, was involved in a project, thanks Dom, Accent Bias Britain, which has very much shown how the kind of association between particular accents has not changed so much in about 50-60 years since they've been kind of looked at in this kind of way. So the associations around certain accents, particularly standard accents, sounding somewhat more intelligent and prestigious, and then other accents being ranked lower on all these kind of value judgments, including often kind of working class accents are associated with strong industrial roots, Liverpool, Birmingham, London, Cockney accents, but also kind of so-called non-native, or might want to talk about migrant heritage, ethnic minority accents as well, which often are ranked lower on these scales of prestige and these hierarchies. So that hasn't changed all that much in terms of how people perceive these accents and the associations that they might have with them. And my own work, which looks at, again, children's kind of beginning to pick up on all this stuff, and it does happen, early on. So work I've done finds that, first of all, children are already starting to group. People are able to kind of have that idea of people belonging to different accent categories from a young age. But then even sort of beyond that, they're already kind of having these biases and these associations, these attitudes developing alongside that. So some research that we recently did looking at kind of the more implicit side of bias. So not necessarily saying, does this accent sound friendly to you or intelligent, but looking a bit more at kind of more automatic reactions to the accents, looking at how the brain is reacting as well. found that even 5-year-old children were kind of showing an association with a standard accent, RP accent, however we want to label it, as being intelligent in comparison to their kind of local accents. This was carried out in Essex, local accent, the Essex accent, and also we used Yorkshire as a kind of comparison accent as well. So that's already existing, that's already kind of emerging amongst, you know, children starting school at that young age, of kind of maybe the school system, formal education is playing a role as well, but the idea of linking accents and characteristics is very much happening at this early age. But the other side to it is that alongside that there were kind of findings that showed that they weren't necessarily as negatively biased towards their own accent, the Essex accent, which we know from research is quite a negatively evaluated accent in the UK. Young kids aren't necessarily at that point yet, so they start out, we know that children sort of start out preferring, or at least being more familiar with, and therefore kind of preferring, in one sense of the word, accents that they're familiar with and that they know, so their local accent. So that kind of negative association, those stereotypes that come in later, even against one's own accent, which we do find in research with adults, hasn't maybe crept in yet. So there's kind of two sides to that story of how those things might develop. Yeah, and I think Anne touched upon that idea, which I'd mentioned in the previous question, but could elaborate a little bit more on now, which is, again, in relation to children, because that's kind of what I work on, that our accent stereotyping that is kind of embedded within things like children's TV and media. So the fact that often it's kind of the more the baddies, the bad characters that have accents that are associated with that the accents are associated with these negative traits that children kind of pick up on and form those associations and kind of take on. Probably things are changing and there is probably better representation now, and you'd like to think that accent diversity is just kind of there, not as a thing to label or characterize or stereotype a character based upon, but just as a way of saying, here are lots of different ways of speaking. I've been watching more children's TV recently now. I've got a young child myself, and so I'm kind of interested in how all of that plays out in certain shows. It seems that accents are still very much there to stereotype. In other ones, it seems more about, here's just a bunch of people speaking, or characters speaking in different ways, which is quite nice. So I suppose that's part of it, kind of the normalization of accent diversity and variation. So not necessarily accent dialect being used as being used for a particular purpose in a way, but just being there to represent the diversity of who we are as humans and the fact that we do all speak differently, just as we would hope to be doing with other characteristics as well. So yeah, I suppose that's partly in answer to that second part of the question about what can we be doing to sort of change things in a way. Yeah, so that's the main gist of what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Ella. Handing over to Nina now then.
Thank you. I'm not sure I've got a ton to add really, based on what Ella was just saying. I think maybe I would add that one of the things that I do think it is quite promising that there is more sort of accent diversity, and there certainly is a role to play by sort of the media in representing a sort of broader range of different accents, particular, I guess, going back to the authenticity question, when people aren't acting, that people can, or also when people are acting, that they can sort of keep whatever their comfortable sort of authentic accent is. And I guess that also goes to a question of who are the people who are doing the acting, and what are their backgrounds, and therefore what is their sort of authentic, sort of comfortable variety. And I think the other thing I wanted to add just on the transmission, I guess, of these stereotypes and these biases, is that unfortunately there is also areas that we have, I guess, less input on when it comes to, because it's not just the media and not just the sort of like immediate environment, but also things like the schools, the education system, where I know that there is a lot of research that shows that that is a place where these linguistic attitudes are still very strongly like linguistic performances are still very strongly policed, and students are being told how to speak and how not to speak in school settings, both in terms of having to speak English rather than other languages that they might be comfortable with, but also a very particular variety of English, a very particular type of English. So I think my understanding is that that is one of the places that is sort of most influential, I guess, in introducing these biases in the first place, especially when it comes around things like intelligence and education. So yeah, the other thing I guess I wanted to raise was just that, I mean, this is kind of obvious, but these perceptions really differ depending on where you are. So prior to moving down to Essex, I spent 10 years in Scotland, and the notion of regional, there's also a lot of research and sort of thoughts around the perception of various accents, including sort of English accents, as something that is very far removed from us in Scotland, and sort of Southern accents being in particular very not just standard Southern British English, but sort of just all Southern varieties being associated with a completely different social class and sort of social background. Yeah, I guess just the very specific context of how this is perceived, and how again, it goes back to this question of what is actually salient to your audience, and what can your audience understand and sort of categorize, because an Edinburgh accent is very posh in the Scottish context, but to a London audience that might not actually register as such. So they might fail to pick that up as a particular sort of social cue, unless there's a lot of other cues that sort of make clear that this is a very sort of fancy middle class person that just happens to be in Scotland. Rather than this is just a Scottish accent, which we only sort of know as either far away or as sort of working class Glasgow kind of general vibe. So yeah, but yeah, I think otherwise Ella has sort of covered everything else that I would have thought of. So I'm just gonna hand over, and maybe there's more questions later.
Thank you, Nina. Heading to Jenru then.
Yeah, it's a way heavier topic than I thought it would be for me. I just have quite a big emotional reaction. Um, yeah, I'm gonna deem I'm gonna look at the regional accents as any accent outside of the so-called standardized accent, and as a coach, it does feel like it's a relentless battle to fight, and especially in most of the accents that I get asked to coach, are East and Southeast Asian accents, and most of the time the character would serve as a shortcut or serve as a caricature, and all of the characters that most likely the actor would face are either shop owner, restaurant owners, or students, or scientists, or in video games they would be like warlord, or like people who kill other people. And especially in video games where usually you would have the main character, or where the lead that the player would follow the most. Usually the director will go, "Oh, actually, we just want a hit of the accent," and it's almost non-perceiving in terms of the accent. It's almost a standardized accent with a couple of features, whereas when it's just a small character with one line or two, the director will go, "Let's go full on with this character. It's fine. They will have subtitle. Da, 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 da." Um, and so in those cases, from as a coach facing actors and performer, the authenticity is not there because it's serving the form and the play. And quite often in my one-to-one settings as well with coaching accents, quite often people will come to me as they were brought up in a Western world. They might not have any cultural references when it comes to East and Southeast Asian accent. But because they are East and Southeast Asian presenting, they get asked to do those accents a lot. And most likely that's the only casting call that they get as well. And so there are a lot of, in the one-to-one session, quite a lot of the time, I would need to go to the clients in a sense that making sure that they feel okay with putting those sounds in their mouth, because quite often they might feel that they are, I don't know, sometimes they might be second generation immigrants, and they might feel that by doing those sounds they are mocking or making fun of older generation, or sometimes they might be adoptees. They might even go, I'm not so sure, can I own this sound or not? Or when I own this sound, it doesn't feel like I'm doing it justice. So really there's a lot of internalized bias as well. And so I think what we can do is really to try to say no to those shortcuts character, and sometimes to go, maybe if we can put those accents, I don't know, what if there is a, what if, I don't know, what if we put this accent into Macbeth, or try different things in a production, or trying, I don't know, what if Romeo has a Japanese accent, and sometimes I feel like I haven't been able to have that conversation yet with people, or even in a school setting. I don't think sometimes that conversation would not even considered at times. And I feel like for performers as well, that would be such a that would be a powerful gesture as well, to go, oh, actually, I might be able to do that. Because quite often when we think about doing, and let's say, when we think about researching an accent, and then putting that accent into a play, sometimes we want to find a play that is already written for the character that is sit within this accent. But then most likely these character would be shop owner, restaurant owner. Yeah. So it feels like a spiral that doesn't go anywhere, but I feel like there is I don't know, it's difficult, it's heavy. Um, yeah, that's me.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you very much. So that means we still have, yeah, a good few minutes before we need to move on. So I would love to do the same as we did last time and just open it up to the panel to have a conversation. Just to say, I am mindful that there is an enormous amount of knowledge and expertise in the room outside of the panel. So if you do have something that you would like to say when it comes to 7 o'clock, even if it's not a question, we would love to hear from you. So just to say that I am aware that there are a lot of very knowledgeable people in the room who may have thoughts to contribute. So we will come to you at 7. So at this stage, just inviting the panel to build on that conversation amongst you.
Yeah, I'd love to just jump in and say, Jenru, thank you so much for sharing your expertise and also your experiences, and to kind of just build off of that. I'm sure as many voice coaches who are listening know, often directors get very excited and they go, oh yeah, I want this really specific regional accent, I want this, and this in particular happens with I know we mentioned Scottish accents already, but in my experience I've coached this quite often, and they'll go, oh, I really want this specific accent, or really reflect the class background of this character, or tell this story. And then you get into the rehearsal room, the actor is doing a brilliant, very specific job, and the director goes, oh my god, no, that's not what I want. That's too, I can't understand it. It's too much. It's too distracting. And so almost always then we're pulling it back to a very broad idea of what that region is. So instead of being that, that specific working class Glasgow, from 1970, we end up with like a very general modern West Coast Scottish accent, but that's enough for them. And so again, it's about really, kind of trying to get that time with the director and going, okay, here's some samples. Is this what you want, or is this what you want? Because often it's also, not necessarily the director's fault for not knowing what that sounds like, because they may have never been there. They're directing a story and their job is to do that story. So also reminding ourselves as voice coaches that actually it's our job to do the research and come and present, okay, so here's your options, and really helping them understand and kind of sharing that, rather than maybe it can be easy sometimes to feel frustrated, I think, with producers and directors, but actually that we can share and that we can not necessarily educate in a pedantic way, but to share what we've learned so that we can create a better story and also save that actor so much pain. Because what can happen is when that actor does an amazing job at this specific accent and are asked to change, they think they've done a really bad job. They think, oh, I must not have been doing good, and the accent coach was lying to me. And it's like, no, you really were doing very, very well, but it's just not what the director wants now. So always kind of not approaching these kind of stereotypes that are happening with shame or judgment on that person who maybe has asked for something or changed their mind, but trying to educate and to help and uplift everyone in the process. And I feel really strongly about that as a coach, because we're there to guide and to help and support. And the person that will support the most is the actor and the director in that story. If we can support them as much as we can, because there's just things they won't know and they don't have time to know it, because they have a different job, and our job is that accent. And so I think that's a really important thing for us to offer.
Can I also add, like, the frustration of people are, all of us trying to do our jobs. There's another another occupation called the producers. Like sometimes it's also very difficult too, because let's say, was it this year? This year I did a scenes from a repatriation at the royal court, where the producer and the director decided that this whole complete scene, they're doing it in Mandarin and Cantonese, and there will be a projection of subtitles, and so the audience would look at the subtitles as well if they don't speak Mandarin or Cantonese, but then at the same time the actors on stage would speak two different languages. But that also means that that show is the target audience of that show would be very different from a West End show. And if looking at it from a perspective of a producer, if I am the producer, I would definitely have a different criteria or things that I would want to look at. So, I mean, yeah, it's just frustrating, but then also everyone is trying to do their jobs.
Are there any more thoughts from the panel at this point on this question, or on anything anybody else has said so far?
I was wondering actually if we have time, and Nina, I don't know if you want to talk more about what the embodiment that you brought up in the first piece, because I think that's also really important to regional accents. And from my own perspective, I'd love to hear your thoughts and your knowledge as a sociolinguistic person.
Yeah, I think just to note that, and I should caveat this with, I am aware of the literature on embodiment in sociophonetics, but I don't do any research on this myself. But it is one of those things that I think has come to the fore in sort of recent years, and people have sort of become more aware of as something to consider in addition to the sounds. I think for a long time the field was much more interested in just the speech sounds, and I think it's really a more recent shift of the last sort of probably over the last sort of 20 years already, of sort of moving to a wider conception of how do people actually present themselves not just with their speech, but sort of with all of their being, you know, like with the kinds of clothes that they wear and the kinds of makeup that they wear and the kinds of groups that they're part of, and all of this sort of like additional you know, all of these signifiers that we make use of to sort of show to people who we are and who we want to be. And the embodiment is sort of, I think, part of that, because part of it is sort of a completely natural part, perhaps, of just you're speaking a particular variety, and therefore you're making very particular movements with your articulatory sort of apparatus, right? You're moving your mouth in a very particular way. But also then there's a layer where you are mimicking other people around you, including probably media depictions as well. So that is there's, and I think this is one of the things that's really interesting as well with thinking about the accent coaching, is how much of that is actually sort of authentic in origin, and how much of that is something that was sort of, you know, had an authentic root somewhere, like a sort of origin point, and then it was brought as a sort of media depiction of like, oh, this is what it's, you know, what you know, a Californian like young woman is like, right? This sort of like Valley Girl kind of like stereotype, like that in some ways is something that then comes back from the media through maybe actors who themselves are not from that region at all, but have sort of themselves copied other models, right? And so I think there's an interesting sort of like feedback loop here as well. And that is one of the reasons why this question of authenticity is really complicated, because it begs the question where that authenticity originally comes from and how it is then transmitted. And the only way that it is meaningful and like an audience can immediately recognize a figure and sort of be like, oh, I know what kind of person this is if it's not too authentic, but a somewhat more sort of stereotype character, because otherwise you can't make that categorization, if that makes sense. You kind of have to draw on something that's a bit more stylized. So that is, I think, where the embodiment is really interesting. And there's obviously a lot more to it than just the facial expressions, but also sort of like gestures and modes of, you know, moving around and things like that. And yeah, I'd also be likewise really interested how that like how if and how voice coaches engage with that when they're engaging with actors, and it's sort of like, and this is how you move around as this kind of person, or whether those are sort of seen as more separate things between, you know, the decisions you make with your body aside from your voice.
Thank you. I'll just let Anne reply to that and then we'll move on.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think definitely yeah, we want to look at those things, and Sterre, feel free and Jenru to jump in, because at Mountview I've worked on their kind of American projects, which basically they're given American scenes, and what's really amazing is we got a movement practitioner and a voice and accent coach in the room at the same time to work on the scenes from those two perspectives. Right. And one of the big things that I always work with, particularly with my British students, is to actually physically take up space with the body. And that so often helps them access the accent in a way that they just had never accessed before. So they can get all of the sounds right, but it still doesn't really sound like an authentic or real American accent until they physically start taking up space. And I just find that is always so fascinating, that those pathways of being, you know, and I know Christina Schul talks a lot about this embodied cognition in her work, and I think that makes a lot of sense. So we talk about, you know, just watching the lips, and we talk about the whole body moving, and yeah, I think definitely that those things are connected. And when we leave those things out, if we get too bogged down by the precision of the sounds, then we actually lose some of the sense of authenticity, especially with regional accents. Absolutely.
Thank you very much. So we're just going to move on to the final question now, which is designed to be hopefully a fairly brief one for you all, just to sort of sum up some key points before we move on to the Q&A. So the question is there a place for more collaboration between voice coaches and linguists? And what would this look like in practice? And so I'm going to bounce that straight back to you then, Anne.
Well, I think I've been very fortunate to have found Beatrice such a generous collaborator, and we've had a lot of incredible places to get to do this through VASTA conferences, as well as through Beatrice's connections at different universities. And so I think, there is quite a lot of space for it, even if we're not necessarily aware of it. And it really affects my practice. So everything that, Beatrice and I are kind of writing about and talking about, changes how I'm teaching at drama schools. And so I think that's really incredible. And I think one thing I think is really useful that I kind of would put as my takeaway is that when I've shared some of this work, especially in spaces for voice coaches, there's quite a lot of hesitancy for this collaboration. And because I think the rehearsal room and the arts are kind of this really amazing sacred space. And I think sometimes there's a fear that that scientific knowledge in some way is going to break that or make it too specific or too dry or kind of ruin the magic of the rehearsal room. But what I think has been amazing from the collaboration I've had with Beatrice is actually that we're all humans. So we all have human experience, we all have voices, we all have bodies, and we all have understandings of these different things. And so by collaborating with other human beings, we just increase our knowledge about what it is to be human. And that's simply what actors are trying to do. And we just allow that to happen in a specific way. And I think the point of the collaboration is that, of course, we're not necessarily trying to get our acting students to become linguists, and they don't necessarily want to write down long transcriptions, but that actually we can collaborate to make that information accessible in a really creative way. So that's a lot of what Beatrice and I do, is talk about, okay, that's the data, here's that, and then how could we make that really fun for an actor to engage with, and what exercise could be used, and does that achieve the thing that we were talking about. So again, just kind of trusting your own creativity when you come into contact with information and resources would be my takeaway.
Thank you so much. Moving on to Sterre.
I mean, I believe that any collaboration is enriching. Whether it's always productive is maybe a different question, but it's definitely always useful in some way. I've found this incredibly useful because I'm already going to change some thoughts in the article I'm currently writing. So thank you very much for some of the publications people have been talking about or ideas that have been mentioned. I'm struggling with my thought processing at the moment. Bad cold, children in the other room. But I might, as I just continue talking, find the thread of my thoughts again. Let's hope for it. I think the research that I've been doing with Jenru, actually I should add, because Jenru and I started that process together, looking into second language speaking actors and their accent work. I have come to realize that I kind of need a linguist. There is so much research that has been done in language acquisition, and that's really, really valuable to our work. That at some point there will be definitely a collaboration in the works. I wonder, just from what Anne was saying as well, I just wonder if there's a way to have access to resources to kind of bridge the work that is available in both areas. I don't know how helpful we could ever be to linguists, if I'm honest, but I think they can be very helpful to us. So maybe that's the slightly selfish way of looking at it. Like, I'd love to pick brains and see if we can, obviously it's not for me, see if we can help the actors in their work and come closer to that authenticity we've been talking about. Authenticity.
Thank you very much. Moving over to Beatrice.
Yeah, thank you. I can only echo what Anne was saying, how fruitful it's been. And I think I've got just a couple of thoughts. One is that I think one thing that's really important is that neither of those two sides feels that, they are the ones that hold all the knowledge. So Anne never, sort of treats me as I know nothing about film and theatre, which of course I don't. And I try not to think, well, this is how it works in language, and that's my expertise. And I remember that the very first conference we both presented at back in Switzerland in about 2 years ago, there was another talk there of somebody who was an expert in medieval German. And the talk she gave was how German films that presented medieval characters always only used a few words from medieval German, but they were never quite right. And, you know, there were much more authentic ways of representing medieval German. And everybody listening to her, I think, could realize why no director or producer would want people to speak in medieval German, because nobody could understand it. But she had exactly the attitude that, you know, I'm very keen not to have, which is I'm the expert. And anybody who's sort of working, you know, comes close to my area must do exactly what I know to be correct. And I think that would be incredibly detrimental. And I've learned a lot from Anne. Anne, for instance, has regularly come to speak to students in my phonetics and phonology module. And I'm sure I'm not exaggerating when I say that's their absolutely favorite session. Some of Anne's colleagues have come as well. And the way she and others talk about vowels and consonants and articulation, and really it's just such a creative way of presenting this that I would have never thought of, that even in those sessions I've learned so much. So yeah, I hope it's a mutual beneficial partnership, and I guess that's how it works perhaps best.
Thank you. Lovely insight there. Moving on to Ella.
Thank you. Yeah, it sounds like the kind of collaboration that Anne and Beatrice have going on is one that we can all hopefully learn from and replicate and do more of, because it sounds like that's a great way to go. So yeah, definitely a place for more of that kind of thing. I think, as has already been mentioned, if kind of making academic research perhaps more accessible, approachable for voice coaches or actors or anyone who wants that kind of information. So obviously it's sometimes quite difficult to access, or there's not necessarily an easy place to go for like seeing what current work is looking at in terms of what we're researching in this field of accent and dialect variation. So that would be a sort of fairly simple approach, simple answer to thinking about how to make that academic research more accessible. So that's kind of coming from thinking about how linguists can help voice coaches. And then the other side of things, as has already been mentioned by Beatrice, I suppose, just now, is I think it's really interesting. So obviously as researchers, but also teachers, when we're first kind of, and lecturers, when we're first kind of talking to students about what accent is and what it feels like and how you might identify with your accent, we've probably got a lot to learn from people who work in more creative ways, such as actors and voice coaches, to think about how we connect with our voice, how we think about the voice characterization, the kinds of individual voice differences that you probably work with on a day-to-day basis that would help inform, again, linguistic work as well, knowing the limitations of the voice. So you're going from an existing way of speaking to a kind of target way of speaking. What are the limitations of that? How does that depend on an individual and their own voice and their own accent? And then thinking about how our accent and our voice kind of link to our identity more generally. A lot of us in sociolinguistics are interested in the question of identity, and how that can be explored through things like drama and telling a story and what those stories are. So I think all of that can work very nicely together.
Yeah, thank you very much. Moving on to Nina, please.
Yeah, I mean, without repeating too much, I think I strongly disagree that there is nothing to be learned nothing that linguists can learn from voice coaches. I think personally, I was going to say my sort of selfish interest is that I am extremely curious what the particular models are and what this figure is that and the particular kinds of figures that are used to then teach people a new accent and how to embody that and how to then portray that and how that, again, as I just said, sort of feeds into the conception that we also have. So I think this relationship is extremely interesting, and their voice coaches have a really important and sort of completely under-researched, I think, role to play. I've not come across much sociolinguistic thinking or linguistic thinking around the role of voice coaches in particular in helping create particular sort of media, particular sort of representations of particular varieties in media, right? Which certainly is the case, but this is so I think there's lots to learn from that in terms of it's just really, really interesting. And as Ella said, there's a lot to learn from the sort of pedagogy as well, because in addition to sort of teaching about accents, there's also a lot of the technical stuff of, teaching people how to transcribe different accents and sort of hear distinctions and things like that is really, really difficult. And students really struggle with it. And I'm sure that there is a lot of, like, as Ella said, sort of very creative methods of doing that are a lot more intuitive to students actually than the very scientific approach that we take, where it's sort of like there's this kind of sound and you just need to listen to it 300 times until it is in your brain and you recognize it. And I'm sure that there is ways of, maybe you can try it yourself and maybe you can try playing with these characters and then it comes to you much more easily. So I think, yeah, there's definitely a lot to be gained from closer collaboration on all of this. And also a sort of appreciation that, and I acknowledge that I think linguists, like many academics, are very protective, I think, of their field of expertise, and sort of therefore sort of go, well, no, this is my corner, and I know I am the expert here. And I think there's a lot to be learned in terms of being much more generous and understanding that, language does not actually belong to any particular field of experts, obviously. But every single person who uses a language is by definition an expert in language and has their own like really valuable insights. And there are whole professions that have very little to do with formal linguistics that have a lot to add. So I think in that sense, it would also help a lot of established linguists probably to think a little differently about the field that they've been working in for a long time.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And coming to you then, Jenru.
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's place for collaboration and like I think any like Anne said, like it sometimes feels like those two doesn't go. It almost feels like oil and water, if that makes sense. Um, but when I remember this is when I went to KTS speech work, the analogy was drawn in a sense that the knowledge is almost like Apollonian, and the playfulness, the embodiment almost feels like Dionysian, and so the two balance needs to be reached. Otherwise, we performers or coaches are just like psychic and calling for the spirits. Are you there? Are you not there? Or without knowing the reason behind it, or without knowing that what is a range that we can go with. So yeah, I mean there were definitely moments where I went, should I do a linguist degree? I'll be lying to say that I didn't Google once or twice. But yeah, I mean, I feel like any collaboration would definitely help us to find more. When I say us, I mean voice coaches, to find more specificity and find more freedom in the range that to play. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you, for being so open and generous with your ideas and your experiences. Thank you very much. So we move into the Q&A portion of the session now. If I could ask for you to use the hand raise function, because it creates a sort of automatic cue, if that's all right. So if you are somebody who wants to, and it doesn't have to be a question, it could just be a comment, especially if you're someone who's mentioned something in the chat that I haven't had a chance to pick up on. But perhaps you have a thought or a question. Perhaps if I could ask you to use the hand raise function, and it will create a nice little cue for us. But I've just spotted that Charlie's put a comment in the chat. So I wonder if, Charlie, you'd like to maybe articulate that in a way that everybody can hear to start with, maybe, if you'd like to unmute.
Oh, yeah. Hi. Yeah, well, the comment was just about, yeah, it would be fun to have sort of virtual sessions with very specific problems that people had on, like, exactly they're doing some play and then they have to do some accent. And, you know, if we knew in advance, we could start like emailing around and seeing like who would be like some good people to have to who either research it or who speak that variety or whatnot. But I had some other questions that I was curious about, and I think it relates to some points that Jenru was mentioning around like the constraints on this as a whole, like bigger process. So I was wondering in the earlier part about you know, the script, for instance, and like how does that already put you in a certain constraint in terms of, you know, you have these lines that you didn't write, somebody else wrote them, and they wrote them to represent, say, a Kentucky accent, for instance, and then you're already like down a certain road, and how do you negotiate with that, knowing that, you know, you don't have full autonomy to change the lines, probably you can't change anything. How do you work within that or confront that? So that was my earlier question I had.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. Thank you for asking that. From my perspective, it's definitely tricky, especially if it's video game, then it will be very quick and very almost very caricature and stereotype. But if it's film and TV, I would always encourage the performers to aim for again for detail and specificity and look for things that like Anne said. I mean, this is also I learned from covering for Anne is that she asked the student to find a specific accent sample that suits their casting. And sometimes if I have the time to work with a performer and if they got a stereotypical character, I would also ask them to find an accent sample that can represent their casting, and then they can dive deeper into that to find the freedom in the constraint script, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess other people have examples where they've come like face to face with this. I just wonder how limiting that can be.
I'll go for Anne. Oh.
Go ahead, Sarah.
I was just thinking about the numerous times that this was at a time I worked at a different drama school, and there were new writers coming into the drama school to work on their material and then create a production at the end of that with those poor drama school students who are not equipped to working in a writing process. It's very unfair to put them in that really uncomfortable place where things are constantly changing, and really still during tech, the lines are being changed. It requires some real support and confidence building and trust and enabling flexibility for those students. And if it doesn't really matter if they're professional actors, because they'll still get really frustrated, but they'll have a little bit more thicker skin, hopefully. But it's a really challenging conundrum that things can still shift. And I suppose when the writing is very specific, I always try and say if it fits, but it is maybe a little caricature, but it fits within the character choices, then I try and let the actor look at that as a gift, rather than looking at it with frustration. okay, let's just say this is wonderful because now I have something to hold on. Let's look at it as a piece of music. Now you have notes, now you have rhythm, and try and be playful with that in your own, find your own choices within that constraint, but try not to work within the frustration, because that frustration will not help.
I think the only thing to add as well is like medium makes a big difference. So when I work on TV sets, you know, often writers are very happy for things to change. So, you know, if you've got an American writer writing for British people, they're always very loud, very happy for myself to give notes or the actors to kind of change it into their own words. But that's very specific to TV because it's written so quickly. Films take years and years to produce. And so the writer has and producers have spent loads of time crafting the scripts to be exactly the way they want it to be. So, you know, often there's not much room at all for the actor to improvise or to change. And theatre, as I was saying, if it's new writing, the writer might be changing it on the day anyway. And if it's something that's older, that's got copyright, you might, again, not have the flexibility to change those things. So that can also change, I think, that relationship with how much freedom do you have to change the stereotypes. And I find my actors in TV, because they get to change it to suit their voice, it's so wonderfully freeing, and creates those lovely textures in an authentic way rather than a stereotyped way that the author may have accidentally written into the script because they don't understand that experience per se.
Wonderful, thank you. Oh, sorry, Jenru.
Sorry, just very quickly. I think this is last year, a couple of years back. Constance Wu, the actor who play in Crazy Rich Asian, she had this interview, and it was a little bit, you know, people sometimes disagree with that statement, but she did say that she got a lot of stereotypical character, but what she decided to do, she was to find the detail in that stereotypes, and so from the stereotypes, she then grow authenticity out of it. But yeah.
Thank you so much. So let's move on to Rosie. I can see you have your hand up.
Hi, hello. Yeah, I can't believe I'm going to be one of those. It's not a question, it's a comment, people. But you said that it was okay to do that. But I'm just, you know, this is like literally what I have a regional accent. So this is very much personal to me. And also it was my master's dissertation research subject as well, which I am slowly trying to get into an article, which is why I'm just like, I've got so much to say, but unfortunately life is getting in the way of that at the minute. But there was just, I was making so many notes, so thank you everybody, it's been really, really interesting. And I do have a question, but just a couple of points, like to answer some of the questions that were kind of posed. One, Nina was saying about who are we catering to? So my research was about not about coaching people to do other accents, but about coaching actors using their native, I said non-RP accent. It's still centering RP. So there has to be a better term for it. But as someone from the regions, the northeast of England, we don't like the term regional. Because to us it means not London, in the theatre world anyway. So I said non-RP accents basically. So how can we can clarity and authenticity coexist on the stage? And I did some action research with some actors, one from Hull and one from Newcastle, to see whether I could work on clarity without moving their accent closer to some sort of standard RP sound. And the answer was yes, which was great. But a big thing came up about who are we catering to, and what is my job as the voice coach? Who am I serving? Am I serving the story? Am I serving the audience? Am I serving the actors? Am I serving the writer? And I think historically, from my interviews with writers and directors and voice coaches, we maybe served the audience. The voice coach's job was to serve the audience. And I think where my research has taken me is that, sorry, I'm nervous. I've got a shaky voice. Where my research has taken me is that I think it's our job to serve the characters and the story. And that brings in Anne's point right at the beginning. That was like sometimes the actor's version of authentic might not read as the authentic. And I think that takes it away from us serving the actor's idea of authenticity, but we serve the writer's vision of the character's authenticity, and we serve the story. So is the story being heard? And the writers were much more malleable about being flexible about authenticity, actually, because their main thing is they want the story to be known, which I thought they wouldn't be as flexible as that. And the way around that they think about it is the writers that I interviewed, people like Samuel Bailey, who wrote Shook, was one of my plays that I looked at. He wrote the play for the boys that he grew up with. So he didn't, and anybody else that comes are invited into the world. But he wanted to make sure that if those young boys who he grew up with, who ended up in young offenders institutes, if they came to see the play, they would see themselves reflected and they'd hear themselves reflected. And he saw that after they got big 5-star reviews and they got on Radio 4, the demographic of the audience changed, but they didn't change how they delivered it. And the director said if it was set in a courtroom, they might change it because now we're in somebody else's world, but it was set in the Young Offenders Institute. So everybody else had to come into that world and listen. But the boys weren't going to change how they talk. So it became context dependent and story dependent rather than who's coming to listen. And I think that's really key. And I think that's a nice way of starting to flip it. So I think that's just what I wanted to add. But a question would be for the voice coaches, with this like level of care about the linguistic authenticity of accents and how unique they are, it's like scared me now. And so since doing my master's, I now only ever want to coach Northeast accents or like RP or General American. And now I don't actually want to touch other accents because I'm so scared because they're so unique. And I know a Geordie accent better than someone who's not from Newcastle. So now I don't know how to coach a Belfast accent or, a Liverpool accent. So I guess I want to ask, how do you do that with confidence?
Thank you so much, Rosie. Thank you for those insights and that question. Could I just ask you to maybe direct it, just because of time, to just choose one coach to direct that to, and rather than opening it to everybody?
Yeah,
Okay.
I guess like Anne or Jenru. I know that they do a lot of accent coaching.
Yeah, sure. I'll pick that up. But I think the thing to remember is that you have the same vocal tract as every other human for the most part, right? Most of us are pretty similar. We all have our unique things, but it means that we could do any accent. We were just born in a different place in a different time. And so I think the encouragement would be one, to learn it yourself, to teach it to yourself, and to honor that and honor all the difficulties of learning that to an amazing extent, but actually that also you can't judge yourself against a coach who's had 30 years of experience if you've only had 3 or 5 or 10. And you can only get better by doing it again and again, and just always having the humility to know that the first time you teach it, it won't be perfect. And so using those samples and encouraging the actors to listen to those authentic samples that aren't to you is also useful, but you still have insights and things to add. And as long as you're always walking in with that humility and knowing that you're not going to, just do broad brush strokes, that you're going to offer them what they need in that moment. You can teach any accent that way.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's really hit on a subject that I've heard a lot recently from coaches, that there's a bit of a fear around. So thank you for raising that, Rosie. So Dominic, please go ahead.
Hi, thanks for a really interesting session so far, everyone. I suppose I'd like to just respond to what Sterre said about whether or not collaboration with voice coaches accent coaches can be useful to linguists, and I would say absolutely yes, it can. I've done a bit myself in the past, and it's been really interesting just to see how, you know, essentially the same problems or the same subject matter is approached from very different angles. We've heard some really good perspectives on that this evening. I work in forensic speech analysis, and one area that constantly crops up in my work is well, mimicry, accent mimicry, whether it's being used for disguise purposes, you know, in a kind of general sense, or for actual impersonation. And in fact, today, at this very moment, well, not at this very moment, but before I came online for this meeting, I've been working on a case where fraudulent impersonation is the subject, the topic at hand. And I suppose that would lead me to a question about the challenges, the particular challenges of coaching actors to impersonate specific individuals who might be very well known, and what sorts of issues that might raise, not just in terms of, you know, doing a convincing voice impersonation, but also the embodiment side of the conceit, the illusion. And if I can also slip in a kind of anticipatory second question, I'd like to know a little bit more from the panel about their kind of prognosis of where the field might be going, particularly with respect to the introduction of AI-based technology and voice cloning and those sorts of areas. So thanks.
Thank you. Would you like to direct that at somebody specifically?
Well, actually, I've talked to Anne already today, and we had a good discussion of some of those issues. So I've had Anne's perspective. I don't want to rule her out, of course, but I don't know who would be in the best position to talk about those. I know Ella personally, but the rest of the panel, I'm not so familiar with their work, so I don't.
Okay.
Please volunteer yourselves.
Is there anybody who has? Sterre, you look like you were leaning forward. Do you have some thoughts? No.
My thought is it terrifies me, and I hear some horror stories, but I am aware that voice coaches are bracing themselves. I just no, I don't really have much to respond with, I'm afraid. Sorry.
I feel like Nina is probably a better place than me to talk about AI. Sorry, Nina. The AI stuff, but do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, I think I can't really speak to it in the context of voice coaching, and I think that is a really interesting question, because in addition to the sort of so the type of technology is essentially a sort of text-to-speech model that these days doesn't require a lot of training data. So even with a fairly small amount of speech data from a person, it is fairly easy to build a fairly good model of their voice. And there are obviously a million implications of that are very concerning. But also in terms, I guess, on the sort of accent and dialect issue, one of the things that I'm sure some of you have come across is these tools to convert accents and dialects as well. So you start out with one variety, and then it sort of produces a different variety. And I think sociolinguists have a very natural sort of aversion to this kind of thing, because usually it is there to sort of get rid of some kind of accent that is seen as not appropriate. I am very curious if that ever is gonna come, especially I guess into video games and that kind of industry. I could see it coming in places where the cost of hiring voice actors is maybe a particular concern. More so than probably in other forms of media where actors are not easily done away with. But I guess, yeah, it is a really interesting question how how that plays in once it is much easier to generate a voice that is, and then that is something that I work on generally with some colleagues in terms of perceptions of generated voices. And I would, yeah, be particularly concerned in this sort of video game space, I guess.
Yes, Jenru, go ahead. I imagine you have plenty to say.
Yes,
Exactly.
it has so there are games using AI generated voice as a character, and it has been produced and published, I think, but I can't remember the name of which game exactly it is. I just saw the post of it, and I was like, oh no, I'm not going to look at that.
I think, yeah.
Yeah, and also I in terms of AI, like I'm terrified, but also I think it's a process that I think it will evolve and it will becomes part of our life. I just think I think it's just as I'm being a little I'm trying to be optimistic about it. I think it's going to be like Zoom session in the beginning when we taught voice with Zoom. We were like, no, you can't teach voice online. But now everyone is doing it, and we adapt and we find a way to go around it, or and now that it's our friend, you know. I'm trying to be optimistic about it, but I think it will come.
Thank you. Are you happy, Dominic, if we move on, or did you want to follow up on any of that?
No, well, thanks for your answers, everyone. And no, I'll give somebody else a chance. The question of impersonation, that's I guess a special case. So let's just put that to one side. Thanks very much.
Thank you, thank you. There's so much to ask, isn't there? This could go on for a long time if we let it. Over to you, Lynn.
Thank you. Just because we were just talking about it, as far as I'm aware, in the US, the Screen Actors Guild voice actors are dealing with this, and there are discussions and talk about getting into contracts AI and issues of not scraping their voices. Yes, to put into a database. And so that's being dealt with. I attended a session on this some months ago. So I'm not sure quite where it is now, but they're definitely looking at it and doing everything they can in Screen Actors Guild to protect themselves from being taken advantage of by just inserting the AI into projects. Then so I had a couple of responses. I was so gratified to hear Anne talk about the honoring the accent, honoring the actor in particular is so huge. Understanding where the actor and the accent meet or don't meet, and how what aspects of the actor's identity can feed into an accent in ways that you wouldn't have thought about when you were first gathering resources. So I found that to be so gratifying and enriching to just from that dialogue with the actor to find ways for them to insert, meld, become one with the accent, and the joy of that is fantastic. And I believe it was talking about speech sounds and forming speech sounds and ways of doing that. So Dudley Knight was my teacher in graduate school, and I learned so much from him about shaping phonemes and phonetic sounds as a way of teaching. So what is the place and manner of articulation, and what is the shaping of the vocal tract or the articulatory setting, and starting there in that technical work with actors after the initial conversations is so useful, especially for actors who feel that they just don't hear a sound, and saying, well, let's look at some shapes and see if you put your vocal tract in a particular configuration and your lips and tongue as part of that, what sound is going to blow through that? So put your lips together and blow, essentially. And that's so useful. Then the hearing sort of starts to come along as the shaping of the vocal tract is getting close or getting very close to the sound they are looking to make. So that's tremendously useful for me in terms of those things. And then my final comment for Jenru is, in the US, at least some theaters, a gratifying number of theaters now are starting to do Shakespeare and, not care about having a unified sound, even with groups of characters. And I think that maybe the linguist David Crystal had something to do with this, because he talked about how actors, when Shakespeare was writing, would have had different accents from different areas. So, makes sense for actors from different parts of the US or different parts of the world to bring their accents to a production. So that's become much, much more. Thankfully, we're hearing so much more of that now. Yes. Thanks. I've really appreciated everybody's comments so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. Moving on to you then, Ben.
Hi, everyone. Thanks. It's been a really interesting discussion. This is coming at it from a slightly different perspective, but I work now mainly on historical phonology and like the phonetics of Germanic languages, especially the history of English. But originally I trained as a musician. So at the moment I'm working on doing a lot of coaching with singers on reconstructed pronunciation for sort of 16th, 17th century English song, which is a really interesting case because obviously there's no native speakers of 16th century English. There's also no such thing as authenticity because, there are certain things that are knowable and certain things that are unknowable. So it's hard to know where to start with talking about the process of coaching the performers. But I wanted to get more some thoughts on the audience reception side of it. So my biggest concern so far has been getting listeners sort of on side, because this kind of music is traditionally sung in not so much LP anymore, but like a standard Southeastern British accent, and by people with Western classical voice training as well. And obviously the situation 500-600 years ago was very different. So firstly, my first bit was, how do we sort of discourage audiences from only hearing the pronunciation at the expense of the meaning of the text? And the second part was, how can we convince people to be more sort of sympathetic towards what we're trying to do when it can be at odds with people's kind of inherited aesthetic taste or artistic preferences for the music? So cheers. Yeah, that was it.
Thank you. Does anybody is there anybody who would like to respond to that?
That was a bit of a left field question.
It's I might be able to. I feel like it's such a big topic, but if the first question is about audience perception, for me it kind of feels, I don't know, because growing up not speaking English at the age before, I would say like 12, most of the English songs I can't understand. So, and that's probably over half of the music that I listen to. And so I feel like in a sense, maybe music, there's a bigger leeway for understanding, in a sense, if people are more willing to listen to songs that are outside of English. But also that's me having my bias as speaking English as an additional language. So I have that privilege. And also the second answer is I think this is Vesta Symposium in Leeds. Barbara Hausman said, if you don't, I can't remember the exact word that how she put it, but in a sense she was saying, if you want to get your idea changed, why bother going to the theater, or why bother taking taking any new information? So I feel like in the theater space, people go in to want to be affected, or to be changed, or to have new idea collide in their brain. So I think I'm being an optimist here, but I feel like there's a chance for people to shift their aesthetic choice and shift their ideas of things.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think when it comes to singing, there's probably a whole separate event that we could put on for that one. But we do need to move on because we're nearly out of time. So I do want to allow Dale just to make sure that you've got your question in there, Dale.
Thank you. And I'll make it. I'll just say something brief. It's really exciting to see this as somebody who's both a voice and accent coach and a linguist as well. And one of the things that I just wanted to highlight was that the history between the two disciplines, involves an idea of who is interested in description and who is interested in prescribing. And it's just exciting to see this, to hear all of these thoughts and ideas where maybe we find that we're a little closer together in terms of what our interests are as coaches and as linguists. And that assumption of one discipline doing the describing and one discipline doing the prescribing, that might be altering and that might be shifting, and how that might open up more avenues for collaboration in both directions. So this was very exciting. Thank you.
Thank you. That's I think a really wonderful comment to end on. And I am sorry if I've missed anything in the chat. But we are at the end of the time. But I think there is plenty of space for more of these discussions. And I would like to thank you all so much for coming and sharing your expertise with us. And thank you to everybody who has come as an attendee. And do let us know if you want to hear more about this kind of thing, because it's, for me, been a really wonderful event having you all here. And yeah, I'm very grateful for you all for coming. You should receive the recordings in the next couple of days. And if you do want to get in touch with me at all, it's louisa@voicestudycentre.com. I'd like to just say a final thank you, particularly to all of the panelists. And yeah, have a lovely evening or whatever time of day it is for you. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you, Louisa, for organizing.
Thank you so much.